Hello students, I am Dr. Amol Rane welcomes you to the course Physics Principles and Applications for FYBSc Semester 1 Physics Paper 2. We are studying 4th chapter Sources of Electromagnetic Waves. In the previous lectures, we have studied the electromagnetic spectrum in detail and some of the types of the electromagnetic waves. We have also studied the sources of radio waves and microwave waves. In this lecture, we will study the sources of infrared, visible and UV rays. Before that, let us study what are electromagnetic waves. So, we know that electromagnetic waves or EM waves are waves that are created as a result of vibrations between an electric field and a magnetic field. In other words, electromagnetic waves are composed of oscillating electric and magnetic fields. So, this is the electromagnetic spectrum and we have already studied the radio waves and microwaves in detail. So, in this lecture we will study the IR, visible and UV radiation in detail and their various sources. So, we know the different types of electromagnetic waves. So, gamma rays, X-rays, ultraviolet radiation, UV radiation, infrared radiation, microwave radiation and radio waves are the different types of electromagnetic waves, right. So, with the increasing frequency, the frequency of the electromagnetic waves increases from radio waves to gamma radiation, whereas the wavelength of gamma radiation is the smallest one and radio waves has highest wavelength. These are the ranges of wavelengths and frequencies in electromagnetic spectrum. So, we are concerned with infrared, visible and ultraviolet in this today's lecture. So, infrared that falls in the frequency range of 300 gigahertz to 405 terahertz. So, their wavelength falls in the region 750 nanometer to 1 millimeter, whereas visible radiation or light that we can see with our eyes that falls in this frequency range of 405 terahertz to 790 terahertz and their wavelength falls in the range of 390 nanometer to 750 nanometer. Ultraviolet radiation, that means the radiation that is at the lower wavelengths than that of the violet color in the visible spectrum, are having wavelengths of 10 nanometer to 400 nanometer, and frequency of the ultraviolet radiation is of the order of 700 terahertz to 30 petahertz. So, let us now study the infrared radiation in detail. Infra means that is far the red light or red color, right. So, in the visible spectrum we have the 7 different color and the red having the highest or longest wavelength that compare to the violet color, right. So, beyond that, beyond the red color there comes the infrared radiation that is having higher wavelength than that of the red color in the visible spectrum. So, infrared light, also called as IR, is electromagnetic radiation with longer wavelengths than those of visible light, extending from the nominal red edge of the visible spectrum at 0.74 micrometers to 1 millimeter. This range of wavelengths correspond to a frequency of approximately 300 gigahertz to 400 terahertz and includes most of the thermal radiation emitted by objects near room temperature. So, all the objects that are radiating the thermal radiation at room temperature, they give rise to the infrared radiation. All the human body or animals, they radiate this kind of radiation. So, infrared light is emitted or absorbed by molecules when they change their rotational or vibrational movements. So, there is subdivision of the infrared radiation, that is far infrared, that falls in the range of 300 gigahertz to 30 terahertz or wavelength of 1 millimeter to 10 micrometer. Then comes the mid infrared, that frequency falls in the range of 30 to 120 terahertz and wavelengths of the order of 10 to 2.5 micrometer. Near infrared, that comes in the frequency range of 120 to 400 terahertz and wavelengths of the order of 2500 to 750 nanometers. Therefore, see the far infrared, the lower part of this range may also be called as microwaves or terahertz waves, because there is overlapping between the microwaves and far infrared radiation. So, this radiation is typically absorbed by so called rotational modes in gas phase molecules, by molecular motions in liquids and by phonons in solids. The mid infrared shown by the hot objects or black body radiators. So, in this range there comes the human skin at normal body temperature radiate strongly at the lower end of this region, right. This radiation is absorbed by molecular vibrations when the different atoms in a molecule vibrate around their equilibrium positions. The third type is near infrared, where the physical processes that are relevant for this range are similar to those for visible light. The highest frequencies in this region can be detected directly by some type of photographic film and by many types of solid state image sensors for infrared photography. So, this near infrared part of the infrared radiation, that is fall near to the visible radiation, right, and therefore, it can be easily detected by using some simple techniques. Infrared radiation, so we can see the sources of infrared radiation. So, it is commonly referred to as heat radiation. So, only objects emitting with a certain range of temperatures and emissivities will produce most of their electromagnetic emission in the infrared part of the spectrum. So, all the heat radiations, that means the objects that are radiating at room temperature, they give rise to this infrared radiation, right. So, all the hot body includes sun, star, galaxies, electronic devices, human body are the sources of infrared radiation, we can say. Near infrared, so molecular vibrations, plasma oscillations in metals, that give rise to the near infrared. Infrared radiation can be used to remotely determine the temperatures of objects if the emissivity is known. This is termed thermography, mainly used in military and industrial applications, but the technology is reaching the public market in the form of infrared cameras on cars due to the massively reduced production cost. Now, let us study the next radiation, that is visible radiation or light radiation. So, above the infrared in frequency comes visible light, right. That means below the wavelength of we can say, in terms of wavelength, we can say the visible radiation falls below the infrared radiation. The sun emits its peak power in the visible region. Although integrating the entire emission power spectrum through all wavelengths show that the sun emits slightly more infrared than visible light. By definition, visible light is the part of the electromagnetic spectrum the human eye is most sensitive to. Visible light and the near infrared light is typically absorbed and emitted by electrons in molecules and atoms that move from one energy level to another. Electromagnetic radiation with a wavelength between 390 nanometer and 750 nanometer, that means 400 to 790 terahertz, is detected by the human eye and perceived as visible light. Other wavelengths, especially near infrared, longer than 750 nanometer and ultraviolet shorter than 390 nanometer, are sometimes referred to as light, especially when the visibility to humans is not relevant. White light is a combination of light of different wavelengths in the visible spectrum. Passing white light through a prism splits it up into several colors of light observed in the visible spectrum. Red light has the lowest frequencies and the longest wavelengths, while violet has the highest frequencies and shortest wavelengths. Radiation from the sun peaks in the visible part of the spectrum, but it's more intense in the red than in the violet, making the sun yellowish in appearance. So, this is the visible spectrum, right. When we pass the white light in the prism, it splits the light into 7 different colors. So, we have the colors, right. So, from violet to red, the wavelength increasing, that means red has the longest wavelength and shortest frequency, right, whereas violet has the shortest wavelength and we can say largest frequency in the visible spectrum. Let us now study the different sources of visible radiation. Visible light is produced by vibrations and rotations of atoms and molecules, as well as by electronic transitions within atoms and molecules. The receivers or detectors of light largely utilize electronic transitions. We say the atoms and molecules are excited when they absorb and relax when they emit through electronic transitions. That means all the transitions that are going inside the different energy levels in the atom, that means electrons jumping from one energy level to another energy level, that transitions gives rise to some form of light and mostly visible light. So, visible molecular electron excitation, including pigment molecules found in the human retina, or plasma oscillations in metal only, right. So, that cause, so visible radiation cause molecular electron excitations and plasma oscillations in metals. Suns, stars, hot metals, filaments of bulbs, LEDs, ionized particles, fire, etc. produce visible light. The wavelength of ultraviolet rays is shorter than the violet end of the visible spectrum, but longer than the X-rays. The wavelength of the visible radiation falls in the range of 10 nanometer to 400 nanometer and corresponding to photon energies from 3 electron volt to 124 electron volt. So, we know that 1 electron volt is equal to 1.6 into 10 raised to minus 19 joule, right. So, electromagnetic radiation with frequencies higher than those of the visible light are often expressed in terms of energies rather than frequencies, right. So, we express the radiations that are we can say having frequencies higher than that of the visible light. So, we express that radiation in terms of energy than the frequency, right. So, it is so named because the spectrum consists of electromagnetic waves with frequencies higher than those that humans identify as color violet. These frequencies are invisible to humans but visible to a number of insects and birds. UV is the longest wavelength radiation whose photons are energetic enough to ionize atoms, separating electrons from them and thus causing chemical reactions. Short wavelength UV and the shorter wavelength radiation above it, that means X-rays and gamma rays, are called as ionizing radiation, and exposure to them can damage living tissue, making them a health hazard. UV can also cause many substances to glow with visible light. This is called fluorescence, right. That means in many substances, if we fall the UV light on that substances, these substances they will absorb this UV light, and the atoms from these we can say electrons in these atoms in that substance goes from lower energy level to higher energy level by absorbing that photons from UV radiation. But when these atoms they fall from the higher energy levels to lower energy levels, in that process they will emit the photons in the visible range of the spectrum, and because of that when we incident ultraviolet light on some substances, these substances they will give rise to visible light, right, and that process is called as fluorescence, right. So, what is mean by fluorescence? So, fluorescence means when we incident UV light on some substances or many substances, then they will absorb this UV radiation and there will be change in the energy levels of the atoms. That means the electrons in those atoms they will jump from lower energy level to the higher energy levels, and after that these atoms in the higher energy level they again fall back to the lower energy levels, emitting radiations or photons in the visible light or visible region, and therefore we will get a glow or visible light from these substances when UV radiation is incident on these substances, and therefore this process is called as fluorescence, or this property is called as fluorescence. So, many substances show this kind of property of fluorescence. At the middle range of ultraviolet, UV rays cannot ionize but can break chemical bonds, making molecules unusually reactive. That means middle part of the UV, when it is incident on the molecules, they will not ionize the atoms, but they will break the chemical bonds between different atoms and they will make the molecules unusually reactive. That means the molecules will become reactive when the bonds between them will be broken. So, sunburn for example is caused by the disruptive effect of middle range UV radiation on skin cells, which is the main cause of skin cancer. UV rays in the middle range can irreparably damage the complex DNA molecules in the cell. That means the UV radiation is hazardous to our skin. The long exposure of this mid-range UV radiation can cause the skin cancer, or it could damage the DNA molecules in the cells of the skin. So, let us study the different sources of UV radiation. The main source of the UV radiation are sun and the other celestial bodies. The sun emits significant ultraviolet radiations, about 10% of its total power, including extremely short wavelength UV that could potentially destroy most life on earth. However, most of the sun's damaging UV wavelengths are absorbed by the atmosphere before they reach the surface. Most of the UV in the middle range of energy is blocked by the ozone layer, which absorbs strongly in the important 200 to 315 nanometer range. That means the ozone layer in our atmosphere that helps us to protect from the sun's damaging UV radiations, right. So, these dangerous UV radiations that are coming from sun, they will be absorbed by the atmosphere. So, some parts of the atmosphere, that means the ozone layer in our atmosphere, that will absorb this UV radiation, and therefore, that hazardous UV radiation that will not fall to the earth, otherwise it could have damaged the whole life on the earth. They absorb, they can be produced. So, UV radiations can be produced by excitation of molecular and atomic valence electrons. They cause injection of the electrons in metal, that means photoelectric effect. So, we know that photoelectric effect is that when light or UV radiation is incident on some metals, these metals, they will give rise to the ejection of electrons, right. So, that means they cause ejection of the electrons in metals, that means photoelectric effect. So, we know the photoelectric effect is the effect when visible light or UV radiation is incident on the metals. These metals gives rise to the ejection of electrons. That means electrons will be ejected from these metals when UV radiation or visible radiation is incident on the metals, right. So, this UV radiation is main cause of photoelectric effect in the case of metals. So, in the today's lecture, we have studied the electromagnetic spectrum and different types of electromagnetic waves. We have also studied the infrared radiation and their sources. We have also studied the visible radiation and their sources, and UV radiation and their different sources. In the next lecture, we will study the next part of the electromagnetic waves, that means X-rays and gamma rays in detail. Thank you.